So hello and welcome to the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author on GHG emissions accounting and reporting for transport. My name is Ronan Mackerlane from the comms team at the ITF, and I'm joined today by Parnika Ray, the lead author of this report, by Alan Lewis, the Chief Technical Officer of the Smart Freight Centre, and Verna Erheller, the Professor of International Supply Chain Management at the IESEG School of Management. This report we launched almost to the day a month ago, of course, at COP29 in Azerbaijan. There's been huge interest in this report, both in the media and online. So we thank you for your interest in that. It's obviously an area which resonates and for which there is much room for improvement. And this unique report, of course, tries to clarify and demystify this area. So we'll have a 10-minute presentation, more or less, from Parnika Ray, and then it's your chance to ask the questions. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Please use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window to ask us as many questions as possible. If you're joining on YouTube or on LinkedIn or on social media, use the link in your window to join us with your questions. So without further ado, over to Parnika.
Thank you, Ronan. So I will start immediately jump into the presentation, given the time constraints we have. So the presentation today is really organized in three parts. First, I'll discuss the objectives and the context of this report, then the key findings, and finally, the policy recommendations. So this report really aims to demystify the complex landscape of emissions calculations and reporting for transport, which is often characterized by a variety of methodologies, standards, and regulations. We've identified challenges and barriers to accounting and reporting and how to overcome those. We've also highlighted best practices and existing harmonization efforts. Now, the accounting and reporting landscape is rapidly evolving for the transport sector to support global commitments such as the Paris Climate Agreement. Several aligned methodologies, standards, and reporting frameworks exist, as shown in this diagram on the screen. Regulations also exist for national and supranational levels. They're in place or being developed to enforce carbon footprint disclosures. Now, while effort has been made to link these different types of interventions together, more could be done to make these links transparent to users and to strengthen the impact and efficiencies of these efforts. So we invite the audience to read the report for additional details because the presentation today is very high level. I cannot get into a lot of the details. As the saying goes, we cannot really manage what we cannot measure. So if reducing emissions and reaching climate targets is the goal, then calculating and reporting emissions is the key to achieving this goal. For that, we need standardized accounting and reporting frameworks, as well as accurate data collection. And this applies to both service level and corporate transport emissions. And when we say corporate transport, we recommend that emissions accounting and reporting includes companies of all sizes, that is, large companies as well as small and medium enterprises. Next, we'll go through the key findings, starting with accounting. Now, the first step of this process is accounting or calculation of emissions. As I've already mentioned, several methodologies and standards for calculating emissions already exist. And one of our key findings is that alignment between these frameworks exists due to efforts made by all stakeholders. There is also significant acceptance and uptake worldwide. However, further harmonization is possible. We also find that the freight sector has advanced more than the passenger sector, thanks to the commitment of industry, of governments, standard setting bodies, and so on. Ideally, the same needs to be done for the passenger sector. In terms of GHG calculations, there are two global anchor points for calculations, that is the GHG protocol and the ISO 14000 series, that provide the high-level diagrams as shown in this diagram on the screen. Both of them consist of several documents that are interrelated and are for different applications. The GHG protocol, for example, is slightly higher level, leaving some flexibility for calculations. In terms of implementation, the ISO is the key standard for data collection, calculation, and reporting for both passenger and freight operations. There is also the GLEC framework that is specifically for the freight transport sector. We also have count emissions and upcoming legislation from the European Commission that is aligned to the ISO. I won't get into this table, but this is just a snapshot to show that there are different methodologies. Some are sector specific, some are more broad, and alignment exists between these. However, we recommend further alignment. The next step after an organization chooses calculation methodology is that they need data to actually calculate their emissions. And needless to say, high quality calculation output requires high quality data input. So input data can be primary or secondary, although the use of primary data as far as possible must be encouraged and incentivized. Organizations need clear data standards and accreditation processes for transparent, high quality and verified data. This data must be complete and accurate and must be transmitted timely. So the next step after data collection and calculation is reporting. Methodologies contain some reporting guidance, but they do not provide the platform for actual reporting, which is available separately. There are several examples of frameworks that exist, like CDP, the CSRD, or the ISSB, and so on. And details of these are provided in the report. Again, while there are several sustainability frameworks that are available, the frameworks are also working to align with each other, to reduce the reporting burden on organizations and companies and so on. Reporting can be mandatory or voluntary depending on the regulations. However, we say in the report that companies that or organizations that disclose their emissions and act upon reducing emissions, they gain investor confidence and build upon their reputation of being responsible. So there is a strong business case for sustainability. While there are challenges, there are also opportunities that exist. So for example, sourcing high quality primary data is one of the key challenges that we identified. However, there is also data repositories that exist, and there is a push to create clear data quality standards and accreditation processes, which is an opportunity. Similarly, harmonization may seem as a challenge, but standards already exist and much work has been done in this field. Future tools or regulations, they must align to these existing standards. Reporting, again, there can be different values, can lead to different big differences in what is being reported. So reporting requirements set by reporting frameworks must emphasize that total GHG emissions or emissions intensity values must be reported, both for a complete picture of the emissions from all transport operations. Similarly, reporting standards must continue to demand transparency regarding data quality, the assumptions made or the omissions made for accountability and credibility. Now, based on all these insights, we have three key messages. One is do not reinvent the wheel, enhance alignment and strengthen implementation of what exists, prioritize this over creating new frameworks. We also say, as I've mentioned, that accounting and reporting is for companies of all sizes for reliable decarbonization of entire value chains. Lastly, transparent, high quality and verified data is also very important. So as a policymaker, what can policymakers do? I've provided the brief background on this and some of the insights, and based on that, we have these key policy recommendations. One is that policymakers must accelerate the alignment of different standards and methodologies to the ISO 14083. For example, the Count Emissions EU is already doing that. They must support collaboration between existing initiatives to optimize efficiency and effectiveness of different initiatives that exist. A harmonized framework and validation process for emissions factors that is applicable internationally must be built. Adopting data quality and sharing standards must also be supported, and as well as ensuring data confidentiality. And lastly, which is very important, is that training and awareness amongst all stakeholders must be done to maximize the uptake of best practices. And that's what we are trying to do with this report as well. So I'll end here. Thank you very much. Look forward to some questions.
Thank you very much, Parnika. That was an excellent and very quick review of what is clearly a very complex topic and a very in-depth report. Those on the Zoom meetings have a link to that report already in the window. It's free online, like all ITF reports. Don't hesitate to delve into that and come back to it with your questions. So now the floor is open. Please use the Q&A function so we can moderate as many of your questions as possible. And to kick off, there's a question on what you referred to, Parnika, in your presentation about the varying standards and the challenges of this. The question is, what can governments, standard-setting bodies, industry, and other stakeholders do to lower these barriers and overcome the challenges?
Yes, I quickly mentioned the challenges and the barriers, but one thing I think I touched upon some of the opportunities that also exist. But one thing that I think we gathered during this report and from insights from experts as well is that transparency of what exists and communicating the work that has already been done can lead to further cooperation and harmonization. This can lower some of the challenges and barriers. We do not want to reinvent the wheel, build on what exists. The example of that is Counter Emissions EU from the European Commission, which is built on the ISO 14083. India and China are also currently, developing, for example, accounting standards, and countries can, take up what already exists rather than building a new framework, a bottom-up framework. So that's the key recommendation that we give in this report to lower to address some of the challenges. And ideally, one point is that for the freight transport sector, it is quite advanced due to collaboration and due to the existence of the GLEC framework, which is a practical implementation guidance to support the ISO 14083. So something similar must be developed for the passenger sector. I think that overall summarizes my answer. Perhaps we'll see what questions come along and then take some insights from Varen and Alan, if possible, on this topic.
Okay, great. So the next question follows up on this idea of passenger freight, and it's about different modes. The question is that the user's understanding is that the status of GHG emission accountings differs per transport mode. We're looking for confirmation on that or not. And if so, does the report include specific policy recommendations per transport mode? If not, would you have recommendations on a modal basis?
I can just quickly answer this, but then pass this on to Alan for some insights. We do not look at specific, recommendations for passenger transport mode, but the ISO 14083 applies to both passenger and freight operations. But we've not looked at individual modes per se. Perhaps, Alan, you want to add something more to that, please?
Yes, I can do that. There is some truth in what's said in the question, because for example, for air transportation, where you have the international governing body and the associated industry association, ICAO and IATA, they've worked together to provide some specific guidance for the sector as a whole, for that mode. And part of the process of alignment that we've been through is then tying that back into the ISO in order to enhance that harmonization. You've got maybe less of that on the maritime side, I would say, but you still have the potential for that with an international governing body in IMO. And then for road transport, for example, or inland waterways, because they are more regionally dispersed, you're inevitably going to get geographical differentiation because of where the responsibilities lie, how things are just organized. So one of the challenges there is to address that regionality, because some regions are relatively well addressed for those modes, whereas others are not.
And if I may just add, we have a short table in the report as well, where we've shown ICAO and IMO some of the mode specific standards that exist and how they're aligned to either GLEC or ISO or the GHG protocol.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Now the questions are switching to the data. side, there's a general question about data quality and what can the public and private sectors do to overcome gaps in data collection. MZ Roth specifically asks, how can you guarantee a high quality data input? I guess the overarching question is, what is a high quality data input? Parnika, would you like to start with an answer?
I can start with that a little bit. Yes, as we've mentioned, primary data, that is what we see as high quality data input. We want as much of industry to use primary data, whether it's big companies or SMEs, because using just industry average may not provide the most accurate representation across the entire value chain. But I think Verena, who's our data expert here, I'll pass the question on to her to give a more comprehensive answer on that as well.
Thank you, Parnika. Thank you also for the question. Perhaps it helps to keep in mind that the overall idea is what we want to achieve is reach climate targets. If we want to reach climate targets, what you need to know what's really going on. If you take average values, then of course you get average results, which are kind of representative perhaps for an industry or transport mode, but they are not necessarily reflecting what is really going on in your own organization. So it is in the interest in the end of every organization to measure with primary data to understand what is really going on in their own organization, because this also reflects where there are inefficiencies. I think that's a intrinsic motivation of going for primary data. Otherwise, how can you guarantee? I think we need to come to something like we have for international accounting standards. You have an approach which is there as a standard, and it needs to be accompanied by an accreditation process where you validate that really the guidelines have been followed. Last but not least, what is needed, of course, at the moment is for those cases where you don't have primary data and you have to use data repositories or model data, that especially for data repositories, we can offer access to data repositories which have up-to-date values, up-to-date data, and which are in line with the high level of data quality we want to have for the calculations.
Yeah, if I could just add on that in terms of digitization, bringing digital protocols for the transfer of data and aligning those and the sort of the format for the data that sits within them to the requirements of the standards such as ISO 14083, and also de-risking that process. Because at the moment there's I guess a question about whether or not operator data would be considered safe by the operators and not open to commercial pressure. That process is already underway, and finalising that in a equally coordinated, harmonised way across the modes and at international level is a big challenge, but it's something that would definitely help here, I think.
Thank you all indeed. Very comprehensive answer. We have a next, so if it's a question comment, if I understand correctly, I presume coming from private industry, and it gives us a taste of what's out there. I'll read it out to you. It says the constant measurement and tinkering with methodologies for emissions is exhausting. What frameworks, standards, and guidance are in place to help shift transport companies' effort and time spent focusing on fuel and emissions reduction, or the use of IT and AI by choosing the right technology solutions? So I'm taking that as being a very private sector transport operator view on how can we help now those companies align with standards that are going to be useful for reporting. Who'd like to take that question?
Yeah, I think I can give a brief overview and then hand over to both Alan and Vera to share their thoughts, because yes, we've looked at in this report at a high level, what the methodologies exist and what is already aligned, and the protocol, GHG protocol, ISO, all of that is in place. There's country-specific also regulations in place, like France has regulations around calculations and reporting, for example. If I understand correctly, the question talks about vehicle level or technology to collect data and then to report this data. I mean, yes, there is tinkering, as is being said, but there is also harmonization, as we've demonstrated in this report. So I believe that already exists. Okay, further harmonization needs to take place, but that's happening as we speak. Count emissions is a great example. But if there is a technology level, a vehicle telematics level question, I think I'll pass that to Alan to elaborate a little bit on that, please.
I read the question slightly differently in terms of the methodological development, the tinkering as was referred to. I think you have to recognize that we are in a situation where this is still an emerging field. So certain things are still going to be developed. We have been trying, certainly within what we can control within Smart Freight Centre, to not change too much, if at all possible. We've fixed with the core methodology, but that's not to say that certain elements around it, particularly about understanding about, for example, the default data values or the fuel emission factors, so the data side won't evolve as more information comes to light. And I think you also have to understand that there are different reporting frames for different purposes. So we are very much focused in what we're really talking about today in terms of operational greenhouse gas emission accounting. But then you get questions about, well, what about the vehicle life cycle? Because there's that extra level around it. It's a different decision point. One is embedded within the other, but they're both valid at different points of making a decision, what vehicle you buy, and then how you best operate it. If you go from one to another, that might be considered tinkering, but it's a question of understanding what question you're trying to answer and then put the appropriate framework in place.
Yes, just to add to that, we've briefly also referred to life cycle analysis and product carbon footprints in the report, but due to certain constraints, we couldn't address everything. So we haven't really focused on that, but perhaps on another report that we can get more deeply into that.
And if I perhaps may quickly add, if you look at the developments we've had over the recent years, you can see that those working on these tools and now on the norm, on the ISO 14083, we are fully aware of this need of bringing developments together. So if you have a look at this ISO 14083, it's building on what was there before. And so that might be a consolation that things are not kind of moving around, but they are really going all in one direction. And as we learn, we manage to improve the approach we have there.
Thank you very much. There's a specific question on ISO 14083 from Natalia Chibeva, who says ISO 14083 defines primary data as the quantified value of a process or an activity obtained from a direct measurement or a calculation based on direct measurements, and secondary as being anything else. So the question is, if we are considering a cradle-to-gate emission factors, including upstreams of the fuel, electricity, vehicles, and infrastructure, is it impossible to have the full EF on primary data level? And is there any idea on how to reflect that in calculations and in reporting?
I think I'm going to just hand this straight to Alan and Verena, because they are really the experts on the ISO here.
Okay.
Alan, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. One thing I would note is that Natalia makes it a statement as it is impossible rather than a question. I think one of the questions, or one of the issues I think you can have is it might not be primary data in terms of data that is generated by the vehicle operator, for example. But once data is determined as primary from a ISO perspective, I would suggest that it still maybe maintains that that status. Within the reporting for the ISO 14083, we do talk about data quality and declaring the proportions of sort of primary and secondary data and which type of secondary data, just to give a feel for what the breakdown is as a starting point. I've seen various alternative methods to express that. But I think that is one of the key challenges as to what's the most reliable way to make that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, perhaps if I can add there also, as Alan said, it's what we're looking for is meaningful result, and the approach, the ISO 14083, does not only allow primary data. It says just that this is the desirable data you want, and it offers alternatives. So I think it is important to keep in mind that this is what we want to encourage. This is what we want to achieve. We are aware that this might not always be the case. That's why we ask for good, up-to-date data repositories, but the objective should be primary data.
And if I may just add to that, in the report, we have examples of existing secondary data repositories, especially the US EPA SmartWay program has a very good repository that is a great example of how data can be collected and shared, but at the same time maintain confidentiality among those operators that are sharing that data. So we've shown that as an example. There are other examples. So I'd invite the audience to take a look in the report as well, please.
Thanks indeed, Parnika. As I mentioned, the report was launched at COP29. In our chat, you can see a quick review of ITF at COP29 and the profile of transport, how it's changing from COP to COP. There's a quick poll for you to let us know if you find these sessions useful or not. There's still time for a few more questions. Please use the Q&A function to send us others. General question on regulation. Is there too much or too little regulation on GHG emissions? Parnika.
Yes, thank you. I think all three of us have opinions on this, and it's evoked some emotions every time we've discussed that. Indeed, there is a fine line between too much and too little regulation, and there must be a balance. And the aim is to really create a level playing field for all actors. And ideally, there should not be different regulations covering the same topic, and some harmonization is required. I'll stop there and then allow Alan and Verena to also share some thoughts.
Yeah, my feeling is that when I ever answer this question, I always say there's both, because there are too many regulations in parallel, and actually some simplification of that landscape would be really helpful. At the same time, there could be better targeting of some regulations and making some that are voluntary mandatory to ensure that there is a flow of primary data from transport operator to customer to inform the decision making further up the chain for those who actually have control over contracts and therefore potentially flows of investment into low carbon solutions.
Yeah, at the risk of repeating what I've said before, I think alignment is absolutely key. That's what we also said in this report. And I think this is what we've been working for over many years now. So if we manage to align further, this will also simplify regulations, because also they can be aligned. That's what I would hope for.
And if I just may add one more point to that, we've talked about regulations, reporting calculations, all of that applying not just to big companies, but also to SMEs. But within SMEs, there must be some differentiation between the different types of SMEs and depending on the size of their transport operations, because a blanket set of rules may not work for all SMEs. So that's just a little bit of a digression, but I think that from the regulation perspective, right now, not a lot of regulations are mandatory for SMEs to report. But somehow, enabling SMEs to calculate and to collect accurate data and to report is also perhaps necessary to support the decarbonization of the entire value chain.
I think that's a really important point, to have the regulation going hand in hand with supporting measures to actually remove some of the burden that maybe comes with a regulation in the current environment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. There's time for one last question, which may be a repeat. It's about modal again. The question is, does the report have a specific policy recommendation to address emissions from international aviation and from shipping? Sorry, I've lost the question. Which are left out of the Paris Agreement. This is a huge problem, and ITF seems greatly positioned to articulate addressing these. ITF, of course, works closely with the IHO as well as the ICAO on these areas. Do we have anything else, particularly on aviation or shipping, to add based on our previous answer? Any of our panelists?
For me, not really. We haven't gone into details of mode specifics, just because there are constraints that we operate within. We couldn't address all the questions, even though they're all very important. We've just shown how the ICAO is in a way aligned to the existing regulation, to the methodologies that exist. But further than that, maybe that's something that we need to look at in future reports. Alan, would you, or Verena, would you want to add something more to that?
Yeah, I think there's a difference here between the reporting processes that link to the COP and national inventories and the situation with corporate reporting, because within corporate reporting, the corporates absolutely include international aviation and international shipping in what they're reporting. And then again, that shows maybe how different systems work there.
Thank you indeed. There's one last question from Heidi Oviden, who asks, do you think that a stronger link between CSRD and count emissions EU, i.e. which use the ISO 14083 for transport, needs to be stronger than what is suggested in the count emissions EU proposal?
I'm not in a position to say if it should be stronger or not. There is a link, and there is a reason why things have developed the way they have. We've explained that in the report. We've also had the European Commission consult on this project, and they've advised us on where the CSRD stands and where count emissions EU stands, and how the CSRD does link to count emissions EU. I don't think I can say if it should be stronger or not. Perhaps the other panelists have an opinion on that.
Well, I can say that I know that there are moves afoot to try and make it stronger. Of course, whether or not that's successful, we'll have to wait and see. But I think both are things coming out of the EU, and there is a desire on both parties to link across, but they have separate processes. So it's just a question of how the bureaucracy allows.
Great, thank you very much indeed. We're at our time, so we'll wrap it up there. We've covered quite a few of your questions. There are more, and there will be more questions. Thank you very much to Parnika, to Verena, and to Alan for your time and your participation. That's the last Ask the Author of 2024 at the ITF, but no fear, there are more Ask the Authors coming up in January. You'll see the links to those in the chat right away. This is, as our panelists mentioned, sort of the beginning, the tip of the iceberg, and a very new area. So stay in touch with the ITF through our newsletters and on our LinkedIn channel to find out more about this area throughout the year. Thank our panelists very much. Thank you for all the participants and your great questions, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.